Muy bien, gracias. Ya, fue realmente interesante oír los comentarios de ustedes al inicio de sus carreras y me hace recordar hacia varios años, muchos, cuando yo estaba en la misma situación que ustedes. Y empecé como biología marina, no porque realmente me interesaba tanto la biología, me interesaba mucho la gente que vive del mar o de la costa, y más la parte humana, que hacía muchos años había muy poco de cursos en universidades que entraban en este aspecto. Bien. Mi título es de, in English, Building Capacity to Practice Coastal and Marine Governance. And I know that governance can be a difficult word. It's really, well, I'll get into this in a minute, what to do, how to react to issues of many types that are at an ecosystem scale, namely both people and nature, not as separate entities, but as a whole. And I think that the first point to make, particularly for you who are beginning your careers, is that you're starting in a very, very different place. We are now in something that's been called the Anthropocene, a time on this planet when it is our species, it is us, that is now changing the ecology of the planet itself. One of the things that this means is that we need to, where we are affecting the planet as a whole, and I think for those of you who are beginning your careers, one idea that I would urge that you bear in mind, and that the Campus do Mar is designed to help you do, is to not only look down at smaller and smaller details. Basically, contemporary science has been largely about applying a microscope to the various elements of a socio-ecological ecosystem. What we need to do is to apply a macroscope and look at the bigger whole. The Anthropocene demands that we do that. And, basically what's been happening since the 1940s, which for those who study and document the Anthropocene is phase 2. It's called the Great Acceleration, that started in the 1950s basically, and then has taken off with this staggering exponential growth of every kind. Here, these graphics simply illustrate the different aspects. I won't go into that, or this will take too long. But in terms of integrating, one of the ways that all of this integrates is that what has marked the flowering of our species, basically since the last great glacier, 10 to 12,000 years ago, is that we have had a remarkably consistent, stable climate. And human beings have flowered during that period that geologists have given the name the Holocene, basically a period of huge stability. That's ending. You could say it's over. We're now in the transition to something quite different. And what is going to happen will be full of surprises. It's going to be a difficult time. It's going to be a very different time. And the issue of governance is, how do we react to this? How do we pull together knowledge, information, values, goals, processes by which we collectively make decisions in a new and different way. This is really very, very urgent. Some of the best minds who have been looking at what is happening have warned us that we shouldn't increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere beyond around 370 parts per million. We're now up around 400, and while various meetings have said, oh yes, yes, we must slow down, we must go back, what we're actually doing is going faster and faster in the opposite direction. So there's lots of talk about sustainable development. Yes, a very good and powerful idea. But let's all be honest and recognize that we're heading more and more quickly towards increasingly unsustainable forms of development use. That does not mean that the future is bleak. It means that we need to think differently. And governance is at the heart of how we react to these things. Oh goodness, I was looking at this and I just see that this came up now. This has two pictures and you have to realize it's the big one. So this is simply showing since throughout the Holocene, the average temperature of this planet has not varied more than +1 or -1 degrees Celsius in all that period of time. We're now hoping that we can avoid going any further than +2 degrees. So far, we've got to +7. So we're still inside that band, but we're rocketing out of it. I think that where we've got to, and what certainly encourages me, is that the latest version of what are we dealing with has been drawn with this remarkably simple picture that ecosystems, or socio-environmental systems, the two words mean the same thing, and I put the word socio-environmental here because in Europe, sometimes if you use the term we use in America, ecosystem governance or ecosystem change, people think, oh, that's just about the environment. No, 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 no. It's about both the environmental and the social domain. The interactions between the two is where ecosystem governance comes in. The governance dimension is really crucial because it's all about what do we do collectively about the cumulative impacts of what is happening. And what we need is predictable, efficient, accountable governance systems at the level of a town like Vigo or like Galicia or like Spain or like the EU or the planet as a whole. My few days here in Galicia once again make it clear, like any other place that I've worked, that the existing governance system is perhaps predictable in a not very positive way. It's certainly not very efficient. It doesn't really seem to be accountable, and it's not really dealing very effectively with the issues that are shouting at us. I had an interesting meeting last night with one of these Acción Costeras groups, and passions ran high, as indeed they should. So governance is at the core. And yet our capacity, and I think that this program of the Campus do Mar is one of the many attempts to get at this fundamental issue, that our collective capacity to practice an integrating macroscope using approach is very poor. We're not good at it. I don't think we teach it very well. We are not, I don't think, learning from the collective experience of the last 40 years in the way that we should be. And that most of us have been trained and continue to be trained in very specialized fields, particularly for a PhD. You have to go down, down, down to produce something new and different smaller and smaller. That is very good discipline. That's not bad, but one needs to connect it to the bigger picture. I would say that if one looks around the world at the various initiatives that are called coastal and marine management or governance or whatever you want to call it, what we see is an increasing number of technically excellent studies, plans, even proposals, even formally adopted. Looked at all the world conventions, but they are not being implemented. It's the changes in behavior that are required, and that's where things fall down. That, I think, is the core problem, the core challenge, or the core opportunity. And for those of you wondering what you're going to do and how you're going to make a living, I would urge you to look up and figure out ways to deal with these issues at a broader scale and apply your specialized knowledge to those broader issues. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves as to what this funny term ecosystem governance means. And this is one of many definitions, but really if one put all the definitions up, they're pointing in the same direction. Key point, it's formal and informal arrangements, institutions, and mores, customs. That structure, how do we use our resources and environment? That's what the conversation was about last night. How do we evaluate problems and opportunities in a way that looks at the whole and not just the parts? Very important, basically, what are the rules? What behavior is acceptable or forbidden? There was a lot of talk about that last night. And what Elinor Ostrom teaches us, and she has a lot to teach us, is that how rules and sanctions are applied is critical to how resources are used. So my good friend Javier Sanz comes out of law, out of jurisprudence, out of public administration. That is very, very relevant to what we are talking about. In fact, it's really at the heart of it, but it's not the only part of it. Now, one of the challenges that all of you face, that those of us trying to practice this ecosystem approach, is that it requires integrating two very different ways of thinking, really ways of seeing. And I've simplified it here by saying, if the environmental domain and understanding it is about natural science, then we're good at that. We know how to describe and document. We put forward scenarios that are very carefully thought through, very logically, technically sound. And we have a very interesting system of peer review so that presumably things that get put forward in the published literature are indeed sound, are indeed contributions to the body of knowledge. As several people said, mi granito de arena, you know, my little contribution to what we know about the bigger system. In governance, what we have to do is to integrate that with the societal realm of things, which is a very different game. Here we're talking about values. Science tries very hard to be value neutral. It's about where do we want to go? What's the goal? Science informs you as to what the consequences of different goals might be, but the making of the goal is something, and this is where we get into difficulties, it's a political process. It's a social process, and it's often seen as mysterious and strange. But that's this side of ecosystem management. It's all about rules and procedures, bargaining and compromise. It's not about peer review. It's about who makes the best argument and who can propose something. Now in fisheries, we've given up on all sorts of things, and we're saying, well, let's privatize. Let's make this public resource belong to a few people, and maybe they'll manage it better. Maybe. Look at the evidence. Apply some science to that and see what you see. It's not quite that simple. So, in this governance realm, I believe we need to focus on issues, problems, and opportunities. Otherwise, one gets quickly lost. And those problems and opportunities group into three big categories. You can read them. This is all quite well known. Something that you also have to keep in mind all the time is that power, the ability to bring about change in a governance system, is by no means only the role and responsibility of government. Governance is only in part, thank you, driven by government. As most of you know, in our current culture, it is really the market system that has the most power and that's really driving the boat. Okay, it works by a very different set of mechanisms. Then there's civil society, really the often sleeping giant that actually can control, influence, change both the market system and the governmental system. That's where a great deal more work has to be done, and where those who work in this field say, oh, well, that's what participation should be about. Correct. But the game of meaningful participation in a governance system is a very sophisticated game, and one that quite a bit has been learned about. Much more needs to be learned. It has to do a lot with psychology. I found it very helpful to learn something about psychology and the dynamics of changing human behavior, for example, with a problem of alcoholism. A lot to learn there in a consumer-driven society. So the practice requires, and this comes from a National Research Council in the U.S. Panel that I had the pleasure of working with for 3 years, and one of the conclusions that we came as to, well, if you're going to try to promote greater capacity to practice the ecosystem approach, if you boil it down, what really is needed? And it's an interesting mixture, I think. It's about how ecosystems function and change. Someone like Javier needs to know, how does an estuary work? If we're talking about the rules and regulations, it's not what it looks like. It's a pretty complicated system. What is the carbon cycle? How does that function? Not just the water cycle. These are some fundamentals that an interdisciplinary team needs to know across the different disciplines. Okay. How do the processes and mechanisms of governance function, and how can they be applied? That's a whole other body of knowledge. In ecosystem governance, which is essentially place-by-place governance at whatever scale, from a RIA like the RIA Vigo to the planet as a whole, how do you tailor what needs to be done, the principles of the kind that Ostrom and others are teaching us? How do you apply them? One of the big lessons is there's no formula in this game. It's all about adaptation. But there are principles. Most definitely there are principles. But how to apply them is much of the work. And then managing effective interdisciplinary teams is, again, what I think the Campos do Mar is working to help people learn. That's one of the fundamental ideas, I think. And this, too, is anything but simple and easy. So the challenge is, and here's just one way of looking at it, is that people like all of you from various disciplines recognize, I think, after what I just said about the scope of all this, that one person cannot possibly know it all. And we do need deep knowledge in a variety of fields. So that is something we know how to do. The question then becomes, what is the unifying set of ideas that can bring together in-depth knowledge of various kinds? So you can visualize it as a T competency, that each person, and I would include here a fisherman, has deep knowledge of one particular field. In the academic world, we have a system for promoting, judging, advancing deep knowledge. The question is, how do we get at a unifying cable of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that will enable people to work together? So again, in the bar, the leg of a T competency, we have a well-developed system for judging people and promoting progress. Where we have done less is to try to think through what is the unifying cable that would enable such people to work together and learn from each other. I had the pleasure of working with a group of practitioners, mostly from Latin America. This was through the LOEX program. I won't go into that, but to see if we could work our way through as to what did we, from our experience, feel that the key cable of unifying ideas are that would complement in-depth knowledge of an economist or a biologist or an educator or an economist or whatever. What's that column? And our hypothesis, but it is a hypothesis, is that these are perhaps the 6 core competencies. And these have been further developed through training courses. We've even tried to think through how would you certify, just as doctors are certified, or lawyers are certified, or carpenters are certified, that they know how to do this, not just think about it, but do. And the thought is that perhaps these are the 6 key competencies. I don't have time, and you probably are all tired of a long morning, but these can be rearranged, if you like, into looking back to understand a place and the context, the past. You cannot really look to the future without understanding the past in a given place. How did we get to where we are before you ask, what is the future that we desire? Then the analysis with leadership. I think it's very interesting that a paper that came out in the journal Science a couple of years ago, led by someone with a Spanish name, I'm not sure where they are, Gutierrez et al., looked at a very large number of fisheries co-management initiatives and looked at the variables of what leads to success. And I think somewhat to their surprise, the conclusion was very clearly the number 1 variable was leadership. Oh my goodness. Can we teach leadership? Or is leadership just an innate, inborn gift? My experience is, and I'm sure yours, to some degree, inborn, but can you teach it, refine it, hone it, encourage it, go seeking it? Yes, you can. So don't brush aside leadership. It's really crucial. The other points I have already discussed. I think that what we all need to learn is how in a given place do you put forward suggestions for a path to a positive future in phase 3 of the Anthropocene, and give it political currency. There's a lot of knowledge out there as to how to do this. It needs to be brought together. And, very importantly, as I talk about the future, we need to do a much better job of figuring out what do we monitor, how do we monitor, and how do we learn? How do we, in other words, get in place the fundamentals for the practice of adaptive management or adaptive governance that is well-informed? That's, again, mixing the best of science with an understanding that this is about goals, values, priorities, etc. Okay, in summary, first statement, I've been saying here in Galicia, and I see a few people look a little cross or worried. You mean it's not all about science and technology? My conclusion is no. This is above all a socio-political process that must be or should be informed by the best available knowledge. But just look at what's happening in the United States. There we have lots of knowledge that global change, climate change is happening, and you have number of very high-level politicians who simply say, it's not true. It can't be true, because that means we'd have to change how we think and what we do, and we don't want to do that. So therefore, as in the old days, take those people, tie them to a stick, and burn them. They're heretics. Get rid of them. That's what we have to deal with. It is, when things get tight, very obviously a socio-political process. Okay. I think as budding practitioners, if you're thinking about your thesis topic, define your issues carefully. Try to drive it at issues that have both social and scientific aspects, and see if you can learn about the dynamics between the two. Understanding and better doing meaningful and sustained participation is the basis of creating political will. There's lots of moaning and groaning about, oh, where's the political will? Well, if political will isn't there, it's because civil society is asleep or thinking about other things. So you need to go back to that diagram of where's the power and what needs to be instigated to make things change. All over the world, there's a great deal of, again, rules, plans, and so on, that even if they're formally adopted, are not implemented. And a lot of it is that the perception is that either they're irrelevant or they're not fair, they're not legitimate. And fairness and legitimacy of any plan forward is crucial. And that's, again, that gets into the participation, that right-handed side of all of this. And as I just said before, doing a better job of learning and adapting is going to be central to what comes. So, I think there's lots to do. I really compliment the Campus do Mar for putting its finger on the basic issue that we need to be more than specialists in just one field. We need to look more broadly. I think that's exactly right. I think that collectively we have quite a way to go to learn how to do that as efficiently and effectively as possible. So, as you go forward, so I gather some of you are first year and some of you are second year in this program. I cheer you on, and I'd even hazard to say that if you apply macroscope as well as microscope to your learning and your thinking, I think that your job prospects are going to be better. It could just be a good strategy in terms of a future career. So, thank you very much. We need to, where we are affecting the planet as a whole, and I think for those of you who are beginning your careers, one idea that I would urge that you bear in mind, and that the Campus do Mar is designed to help you do, is to not only look down at smaller and smaller details. Basically, contemporary science has been largely about applying a microscope to the various elements of a socio-ecological ecosystem. What we need to do is to apply a macroscope and look at the bigger whole. The Anthropocene demands that we do that. And, basically what's been happening since the 1940s, which for those who study and document the Anthropocene is phase 2. It's called the Great Acceleration, that started in the 1950s, basically, and then has taken off with this staggering exponential growth of every kind. Here, these graphics simply illustrate the different aspects. I won't go into that, or this will take too long. But in terms of integrating, one of the ways that all of this integrates is that what has marked the flowering of our species, basically since the last great glacier, 10 to 12,000 years ago, is that we have had a remarkably consistent state. Muy bien, gracias. Ya, fue realmente interesante oír los comentarios de ustedes al inicio de sus carreras y me hace recordar hacia varios años, muchos, cuando yo estaba en la misma situación que ustedes. Y empecé como biología marina, no porque realmente me interesaba tanto la biología, me interesaba mucho la gente que vive del mar o de la costa, y más la parte humana, que hacía muchos años había muy poco de cursos en universidades que entraban en este aspecto. Bien. Mi título es de, in English, Building Capacity to Practice Coastal and Marine Governance. And I know that governance can be a difficult word. It's really, well, I'll get into this in a minute, what to do, how to react to issues of many types that are at an ecosystem scale, namely both people and nature, not as separate entities, but as a whole. And I think that the first point to make, particularly for you who are beginning your careers, is that you're starting in a very, very different place. We are now in something that's been called the Anthropocene, a time on this planet when it is our species, it is us, that is now changing the ecology of the planet itself. One of the things that this means is that stable climate, and human beings have flowered during that period that geologists have given the name the Holocene, basically a period of huge stability. That's ending. You could say it's over. We're now in the transition to something quite different. And what is going to happen will be full of surprises. It's going to be a difficult time. It's going to be a very different time. And the issue of governance is, how do we react to this? How do we pull together knowledge, information, values, goals, processes by which we collectively make decisions in a new and different way? This is really very, very urgent. Some of the best